cut each other up, and then to have the party come to him. He has been seeking it for some time, and he has some liabilities. He's completely aware of that. But if the party has to come to him, that would have a much greater effect. That probably isn't going to happen, although it could happen, but only if it appears from polls that are taken about 6 months from now, or I would say just before the Democratic Convention, that he and only he could beat Reagan. If the polls show that, watch out. He'll be the candidate.
Was this a real holiday from politics in terms of everything that was being done to further or develop your candidacy?
By no means. As a matter of fact, prior to taking off on my trips, I got together with some of my closest friends and political associates, people like Bob Hill and John Lodge and others in the Waldorf Hotel in New York. We had an all-day session. I said, look, I'm not going to play any games with my closest friends here. I think it's time to start an organization for the presidency in 1968. I want you to do everything you possibly can to develop the funds, to raise the funds, to develop the organization, to get the commitments that you can, so that when I do make a decision, that the game play will be there, ready to go into force. And so consequently, that's when it all began. The amazing thing, incidentally, in retrospect, I think the remarkable thing in retrospect that happened in that year, 1967 and 1968, that we were able to do it with so little. Rockefeller had unlimited money. He had hundreds of people, not just 10, not just 20, but hundreds of people, paid people on his staff, pollsters and speechwriters and political operators and local people and the rest. We had 4. We had Rosemary Woods and Pat Buchanan and Ray Price and Dwight Chapin, and Bob Ellsworth part-time. That was it in the year 1967. We had no money. Al Cole of Reader's Digest went out and raised money enough to finance some of my foreign travels. I financed a lot of it from my writing and legal activities and so forth and so on. But with very little money and very small staff throughout that year, we were able to stay even with the Rockefeller forces and so forth. We did it through volunteers. Let me say this. It's very important for candidates to realize that a big staff is not always an asset. The bigger the staff, the less the candidate does his own thinking. The smaller the staff, the more dedicated first they will be. But even more important, the more the candidate is going to have to sit in his fanny and do the hard work to think the problem through. And that's what it forced me to do. So that by the time 1968 came around, I was ready. I was ready not simply because I could have a staff to give me this paper or that paper, or to put something on a teleprompter for me to read. I was ready because I had it all up here in my head. And so being poor, quote unquote, at that particular time politically, turned out to be an asset, in my view.
Wasn't it at this time that your mother died?
She died in September of 1967. That was right after I finished the 4th of my trips. In fact, the trip was to Africa. The African trip was the last one. And I remember very vividly how I got the news. I was in the office actually working on some legal work, and I had a call from Rosemary Woods, buzzed me. She said, your brother Don's on the phone. I said, well, tell him I'll call him back. And because I've got some people in the office with me right here. And she said, no, you better take the call. I said, your mother just died. Well, it was not a surprise. She had had a stroke about a year or two before. But it's always a shock. And the worst part of it, of course, was telling Mrs. Nixon the phone and telling Tricia and Julie. So we got on the plane and we went out to the funeral. Funerals are always difficult, but of course, in this case, it was perhaps the most difficult one I've ever attended. because I was so close to my mother and my father as well. The funeral was held in the little church where I used to play the piano in Sunday school, and where we used to go, I remember, with my mother and father twice on Sunday and even to prayer meetings sometimes on Wednesday. So it was a very closely knit group of friends and family. However, the church was simply thronged with people, and there were scores outside because my mother was one who had no enemies, but had tremendous number of friends. She was a very, as I have remarked on occasion, a quite remarkable woman, as are most of our mothers. But she was very special. I know, for example, one thing that's rather amusing. My grandmother, her mother, lived 2 miles up the road from us on Whittier Boulevard. That's now Route 101. And my grandmother and my mother were alike in one respect. In the Depression years in 1934 and 35, 36, 37, the tramps would come along. And they'd have, I understood later, a piece of ribbon hanging on a tree in front of those houses that were soft touches. My grandmother's house always had the ribbon, and no tramp ever stopped that didn't get a meal there. And no tramp ever stopped at my mother's place that didn't get a meal as well. But that was only part of it. I remembered particularly vivid memories of what she did when my brother Harold was sick. She went to Arizona with him. And in order to make ends meet, she took care of him, another boy by the name of Leslie, another one by the name of Larry, and another that we called the Major. He was a Canadian major that had been gassed in World War I, as a matter of fact. And all of them were there with tuberculosis. 3 of them were bed patients, not ambulatory. And she took care of all 4, cooked for them, gave them their alcohol rubs in the morning and at night, changed the bed linen, and did it by herself for 2 whole years. And then as each one of them died, she'd get the news it was if her own child had died. Harold died last. But in any event, we got there to the church, and there were no tears up to that point because I'm not given to outward displays of emotion too often. But as I came through the line at the end, the ministers were at the door, and Billy Graham had flown out. He had liked my mother, and she had admired him. She had heard him and admired him when he was just starting, and he never forgot that. And when I saw Billy, all the emotion just came flowing out, and I started to cry. That's one of 3 times that I can remember ever crying in my adult years. The first time was after the fund crisis, when Bill Noland congratulated me for my speech. This was the second time. The third time was when President Eisenhower had died. But in any event, the emotion poured out. We followed the hearse out to Rose Hills, and she was buried there in the same plot next to my father and Harold and Arthur, my younger brother. And so we got in the airplane, and we start to go back, and I just thought back over the years. That's the kind of thing that runs through your mind, that we've done. And a lot of memories came back of my association with her, how close she was to me and to the rest of the family, and how much she'd meant to us. And I remembered particularly, and it sticks in my mind now, the last time I really ever had a conversation with her. This is before she had her final stroke. She'd had a terrible operation. She'd had gallstones all her life, and for a long time couldn't afford an operation, and then wouldn't get it, didn't want to pay for it, and so forth and so on. So finally she had the operation. And I remember visiting her there at the hospital, and she looked so tired and so dispirited, and her arms were so thin. I remember out of her nightgown, as I looked at her, she'd lost an awful lot of weight. And I could see that she was depressed, which was unusual for her because she never shared her problems with anybody else. And as I was getting ready to leave, I said, Now, Mother, don't you give up. And all of a sudden, this spark came into her eye. She raised up on her elbow and she looked up at me and she says, don't you give up. Don't you give up. Don't let anybody ever tell you you're through. And as I left, I wondered why she had said that. And I saw a copy of the Los Angeles Times out in the reception room. And there was a column in it where a columnist had said that President Nixon is, or Vice President Nixon is through. There is no way that he can ever recover from his defeats in California and for the presidency earlier. She apparently had seen that. But I was just thinking, very few people in politics have a legacy like that. Don't you give up. Don't let anybody ever tell you you're through.
You've talked about your the emotional reticence in your family and your own. Did you ever tell your mother that you loved her?
No, we don't do that.
Did you ever,
No.
Looking back, do you ever wish you had
No.
been able to express it
No,
more?
and she didn't engage in that either. The affection, the love we have for each other was not expressed that way. Like, as I've often said, I think most people were, my mother always stated things in a very low-key way. Now, these days, if you're a good churchgoer and so forth, you're supposed to say, I'm praying for you. She never said that. If I was going to make a speech or going through a real difficult crisis, she would write me a note, or she would just say on the phone, I'll be thinking about you. Now, because she said that, some of the critics would say, well, why didn't she say, I'm praying for you? That was not her way. Love, I think, can be expressed in different ways. And I don't object to the way people today slobber over everybody else. I love you, like Johnson would and so forth. And many people in and out of public life. I understand that. But we're all a little different. In our family, we expressed our love through our deeds in a quiet way, rather than feeling that we had to burp it out every time it came into our minds.
What effect did your mother's death have on you?
Well, it was an emotional experience that was very substantial, but I think the major effect it may have had was the memory of that last conversation. Don't ever give up. I think that's what it was.
Do you remember if there was a moment, how and when, at what moment, you decided to run for president in 1968?
Oh, I remember it very well, because that's something you don't do that very often. Run for president, that is. Well, Harold Stassen does, but on the other hand, in this case, it was only the second time I had determined to run for president. And the way it happened was this. I had been thinking about it, of course, and the program was underway in late 1967. Money was being raised. People were being organized. I had been calling on governors and senators and congressmen and so forth and so on, never incidentally asking anybody to support me, however. I didn't do it that way. I don't believe in going into a governor or a congressman or a senator and say, look, will you support me? I always believe in presenting what I stood for, and then saying, if you feel that I can provide the best leadership to accomplish that particular goal, I would appreciate your support. But in any event, after having gone through all that, I decided to go to Florida and make a final decision to consider everything, because I didn't run for president lightly. I knew what an ordeal was to go through. And so under the circumstances, I didn't want to do it again, and I particularly didn't want to put my family through it again.
How did they react even to the possibility?
Well, under the circumstances, the reaction was quite different from what had been when I decided to run for governor in 1962. I remember we had dinner at our apartment, and Julie, with her typical fighting attitude. She said, "You've got to run. You've got to do it for the country." And Tricia, approaching it in a slightly different way, she said, "You have to do it because otherwise you'll have nothing to live for." And Mrs. Nixon, Pat, was put it a little different way. I knew that she wasn't very enthusiastic for it, but she said, "Just be sure that whatever you do, we love you and we'll support you." And so I took off from Florida.
Was Tricia right? If you hadn't run for president in 1968, would you have had nothing to live for?
At that time, yes. Yes, because basically my orientation was to engage in political activities. And there wasn't anything else I could engage in at that point that would really be enough of a challenge. You say run for House, run for the Senate, run for governor, or be a columnist or what have you. That wasn't enough. I think the only other thing I think many people would perhaps question as to whether there couldn't have been a challenge in another way. And I must say my good friend B.B. Rebozo, who's very successful financially, particularly as a banker, often said, "Just wish I would be more interested in what I'm doing financially to make some money." And I understand that for many people that's the beginning and end of it all, but it just doesn't interest me. I want enough to be comfortable, but to make a great fortune is something that I'm not interested in.
What do you have to live for now?
Well, that's something we can come to when we get to the end of the program.
Why did you go to Florida to make this decision?
Well, I wanted to be away from New York, away from telephone calls and so forth, be by myself. And my long experience in going to Florida with B.B. Rebozo and so forth he understood that. He was a very good friend. He's never one that wanted to sit down at the throne and have me confide in him as to what my decision was. I never discussed it with him, as a matter of fact. That's why he was such a good friend.
Even when you were there?
No. He's the kind of a man, very, very unusual. Most people that you know, that politicians know, and I understand this, they want to sit with the man and help him decide. But B.B. knew that I was somewhat of a loner, that if I wanted his opinion, I'd ask it. He never raised a question about it. If I had asked him, he would have given his opinion. But I knew before, without asking him, that he felt I should run. Particularly, he felt that way because he was pretty bitter about what happened in 1960. He wanted to reverse that situation. The other one that was down there was, however, and I didn't know he was going to be there before the trip was scheduled, was Billy Graham. He was recovering from a long bout of some pulmonary infection, had a terrible cough and that sort of thing. And we had a long, long walk on the beach. I remember about a 2 or 3 mile walk. He was so tired at the end that he had to sit down for a while and rest. And he was one who always gave me his best advice. And in this instance, he was very strongly of the opinion I should run. He had just come back from a trip around the world. He said every place in the world the U.S. is in trouble. Every place in the world it is essential that the U.S. provide better leadership than is being currently provided. He said, if you don't run and provide that leadership, I think the world is going to be in deep trouble. That had considerable impact on me.
We know the end of the story because we know you decided to run and won. Was there a moment at that time in Florida, that weekend, I guess, in Florida, that tipped the balance, or that you finally decided this is it and from now on I go direct?
I would say that the moment really was the Billy Graham moment, if there was any one. I don't mean that I was asking Billy Graham to be the judge on high to decide it, but when he talked about the people around the world, when he talked about his own huge constituency, not that he was going to deliver it, because he would never try to do that, the need for the leadership that I might provide. That made an impression on me. In other words, the idea that I would be running not just for personal purposes, that wasn't going to be enough, but for a cause. The important thing to bear in mind here is that for one to succeed in running for the presidency, he must, above all, want to be president to do something, not just to be somebody. I had already been somebody. I'd been vice president. Wasn't going to get anything more out of being president, in my opinion. But the important thing was to have a cause and to feel that you are best qualified to bring about the answers to that particular cause. That was really the thing that motivated me.
Why did you win the presidency in 1968?
Well, I won, I would say first, I think because I did have a cause. The cause being the need for new foreign policy leadership in the United States and in the world. Leadership that only the United States could provide in the world. Second, as far as that need was concerned, I, in 1968, I think I can say somewhat objectively now in retrospect, was the best qualified person. I didn't go out telling people that, but most people were aware of that. I had traveled broadly. I'd had a lot of experience as vice president under President Eisenhower, and there was no one else on the scene who had that kind of qualification. And third, I had a hard core of supporters. All of that helped me in terms of winning.
By the end, it was razor close. Did you think you were going to win as election night arrived? And in view of what they'd gone through in 1960, 1962, how did you prepare Mrs. Nixon and Tricia and Julie for election night?
Well, what had happened was that right after our nomination and after the nomination of Hubert Humphrey, the polls showed that we were going to win very, very handsomely or decisively. But I knew that wouldn't last. First of all, because Hubert Humphrey was a very good candidate. My, when you compare him with the likes of Mondale and Glenn and these other fellows that are running around looking for the Democratic candidate, it's just too bad Hubert isn't alive today, because he can make the Eagles scream. But Hubert Humphrey was a good candidate. Second, there are a lot more Democrats than Republicans in the country. Third, I had the additional liability of George Wallace running on the third party ticket. Now, he was a Democrat, but on the other hand, all polls indicated he was drawing 2 votes, because I being a conservative and he being a conservative, 2 votes from me for every one that he was drawing from the Democratic candidate. And then fourth, of course, they still had the White House, and that White House almost finished us off with a bombing halt, which was called just 3 or 4 days before the election. But be that as it may, I still felt we were going to win. But I must say, just before getting on the airplane, which was to take us from California back to New York, I got a shock because somebody came up to me at the airport and stuck a microphone on my face, and what do you think of the latest Lou Harris poll, which had been taken that morning? This is the election morning, and came out election morning, I should say. It was in the Los Angeles Times. It shows Hubert Humphrey winning 53 to 47. Well, that was a shift, because no poll had ever shown Humphrey winning yet. The Gallup poll still showed me slightly ahead. That, incidentally, would mean Humphrey winning by a majority of 5 million votes. I said, well, I'm not going to comment on the polls. So I had that in the back of my mind. Well, I climb on the airplane, and it was a festive occasion. The staff had balloons around and placards, President Nixon. I said, my God, I hope they're right. So I decided that we ought to really have a little family conference. And so I got Mrs. Nixon and Tricia and Julie together. And I said, look, I think we're going to make it. But more important, I think we can be assured it will not be a long evening like it was in 1960. I proved to be a very poor prophet in that respect. But I said, what we have to be prepared for is the possibility of an upset, because, you know, they've been coming on hard, been outspending us in these last 2 weeks, the bombing halt and all that. I still feel we're going to make it. And incidentally, I was confident to the last. I felt even then that though it was going to be close, because even though the polls had narrowed, as I looked at the critical states, I didn't think there was a way Humphrey could win an electoral college vote. I was particularly interested then in being very sure I didn't win the electoral college vote and he got a majority, or at least I should say a plurality of the popular vote, which of course he did, and we finally won the popular vote by 500,000.
In the end, do you think Wallace helped him or you? Because the argument is that the people that voted for Wallace turned out, although they were conservatives, they were Democrats, so that in the end they siphoned more people from him than they did from you.
No, there's no question about that, because all the pollsters, Gallup and others who polled after the election, found that the Wallace vote would have gone twice as much for Nixon as it would for Humphrey. In other words, the Wallace vote was an anti-administration vote, an anti-Johnson vote, an anti-Humphrey vote. And if Wallace had been out of it, I think Gallup reported that it would have been a landslide in the magnitude of about 56 to 44, about the same as the Eisenhower landslide of 52, if Wallace had not been in. And he got 12% of the national vote, as we know.
At what point on election night or election morning did you finally feel confident that you were the 37th President of the United States?
I felt confident about 3 o'clock in the morning. That was before some others did, because again, I looked at the state-by-state analysis. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, when I heard that we'd won Missouri, I thought we were going to win. Kevin Phillips was one of the few people who predicted we would win Missouri, and that was somewhat of an upset, but we did win it, because I knew that we felt that we had California for sure, and we did win that by 250,000 votes, which was pretty good under the circumstances, with all the tough campaigning that had taken place in California in those last few days. But I had it figured out that with Missouri and New Jersey, these are the second states, that in addition to that, we would win California, we would win Ohio, win Illinois. We had to win 3 of the big 7, as they were called then. That would mean we could lose Texas, lose New York, lose Pennsylvania, still win the election. That was my strategy. And as I looked at the results at 3 in the morning, I went over them with Murray Chotiner, as a matter of fact, the shrewdest observer we had. I said, well, we've got it made. I told my staff, I think it's made. None of them disagreed, although I think some of them were really worrying.
Did you tell Mrs. Nixon?
Not then. No. I didn't want to tell her and then have her be disappointed at a later time.
When did you tell her?
Not till the next morning. The next morning, it was around 6 in the morning or 7 in the morning. We'd stayed up all night. I was hoping to be able to go down and tell her much earlier, but I knew the traumatic effect that 1960 had had on her in 1962, and I thought, my God, I don't want to get her hopes up and then have them dashed. That's the worst thing you can do. So she was down in another suite with Elaine Brown and Tricia and Julie, and I was in this suite with all the political people, and I kept waiting, when can I go tell them? And so until I felt we got a little bit more nailed down, I shouldn't do it. The real question at that point, we knew we had California by 7 in the morning. That was clear. We knew we had Ohio by 100,000 votes. That was clear. We needed only one more state, and it turned out to be Illinois, of all states. And we were ahead in Illinois by 100,000 votes. But Cook County wasn't all in. And so, under the circumstances, I couldn't be sure. But Dwight Chapin, I remember, burst in with the news, ABC has just conceded. I said, what about CBS, NBC? Not yet. Well, maybe that's it. But I still waited. Finally, NBC conceded. And then, finally, CBS. It was the last. I'll never forget Walter Cronkite. You know, I felt a little sorry for him. I don't have any hard-on against him because we've had some pleasant times together, particularly at the space splashdowns and so forth. But he was obviously, of course, pro-Humphrey, which I understood. And I've never seen a man look so sick. I thought he was going to cry. He did wait an hour after NBC and ABC to make his announcement. But I didn't care. It was done. So I went down and I saw Mrs. Nixon, I said, well, we've got it. She says, are you sure? And I understood that that night she had been sick to her stomach because she heard that Illinois was still in balance, and the commentators were pointing out that it had been lost in 1960 because of hanky-panky in Cook County. And I said, yeah. She said, what about Illinois? I said, look, we're ahead by 100,000 votes. There's no way they can steal 100,000 votes in Cook County. Are you sure? I said, yes. And she started to cry again, and so that was, and threw her arms around and said, oh, thank God, I hope you're right. Well, we were right.
How did it feel after all that time and all those years to be the President of the United States?
Well, you didn't get the lift out of it as if we had won it in 60, I think. But having gone through the trauma of coming so close and losing, and then becoming prepared and feeling quite sure that I was going to win. I wasn't overconfident. We campaigned hard throughout that period. I mean, the mythology to the effect that we just sort of dogged it and didn't campaign hard in 68, that's just nonsense. We went on with 2 3-hour telethons from California the day before the election just to be sure that we didn't have the thing taken away from us in the last few minutes. But under the circumstances, it was not therefore that big a surprise to me. In other words, I think when you say how does it feel, if something comes almost unexpectedly, then it has a greater lift, gives you a much greater lift than if it comes when you do expect it. Don't mean I was overconfident, but I was inwardly pretty confident and pretty, frankly, fatalistic about it. If we had not won, I would have taken it reasonably well. So under the circumstances, I would say that I was prepared for it because I thought we were going to win, and so we got underway.
What did you do? What was your first morning as President-elect like?
Well, it should be, I suppose, some mountaintop experience, but never is that way. It turns out to be something something that everybody can relate to. We went back to our apartment on Fifth Avenue, and I said to Pat and the girls, I said, look, I think we really ought to go out to, this is election, the day after the election day, I think we ought to go out to lunch. And they said, no, we really couldn't go out to lunch. I mean, after all, by that time, hordes of reporters were around, and the Secret Service was there, and all the rest. We just couldn't do it. Well, unfortunately, in the department, we didn't have any help. I didn't find out later as to why. What became of the help? Were they dogging it or something? Because this was the day after the election. And what had happened was that Manolo and Fina Sanchez, who were of Spanish background, that was the day they went down to be sworn in as citizens of the United States. And they were down getting sworn in. Later, they came back and very proudly they said, next time we can vote for you for re-election as president. They were proud. But in any event, we didn't know that at a time that we were trying to find out what to have for dinner. And so Pat and the girls got some eggs, and they scrambled some eggs, and they made some bacon. And so we had bacon and eggs as our victory feast there in our apartment on Fifth Avenue. And so after that, I was pretty tired because I'd been up all night the night before that everybody went to bed. And so I went into my library and built a fire and got out one of my favorite records, Victory at Sea. I don't know why I picked it, but I've always liked the record. And so I put it on the machine, I tuned it up and opened the windows so that everybody on Fifth Avenue, 5 blocks below, could hear it. And it blasted out, Victory at Sea. That's the way I celebrated.
Roger Ailes, always a legend in his times and our times, always tells everyone, as a matter of fact, as early as this morning, he was telling me that without him you couldn't be president. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, if I had to pay everybody that says that, I would be broke at the present time, and I'm not that wealthy in any event. But in any event, I suppose what he's talking about are the campaign techniques of the man in the arena and that sort of thing. We developed a lot of very effective campaign techniques in that campaign, and that was one of the best, where people got a chance to participate in it.
that point, we'll break for lunch.
Unauthorized question, Shannon. Okay, that's all.
Okay, this is a real marathon now.
Yeah, but you've got plenty of time,
Yes.
so we can do it. We'll make it. It'll move fairly fast.
We'll get fairly fast through this Japan de Gaulle. That's not on a 10-point scale. That's of a lesser. Yes? Sorry? 3:30. Henry Kissinger apparently had some difficulties, to put it mildly, dealing with the North Vietnamese in the negotiations.
Oh, did he? I recall when he came back toward the end, just before we finally made the agreement, he said, you know, the Vietnamese are just, let's start again. I remember when I remember one occasion particularly when he came back after a very tough negotiation in 1972. And he said, you know, the North Vietnamese are just shits. They're just filthy, tawdry shits. He said, they make the Russians look good, just as the Russians make the Chinese look good when it comes to negotiating. That's the other way around.
No,
I mean, you said, no, because, hold it just a second. Let me tell you why. The Russians don't make the Chinese look good. The Chinese make the Russians. That's right. Now, we had it right. Go ahead. All right.
What did you think of the recent Kissinger interview, where he sort of backtracked on his opinion about the Pentagon Papers, where he said that at the time he felt it was wrong to publish them, but now he feels, although it's wrong to take papers, that the media should not censor itself in terms of the publication of documents like that?
I don't agree. I agree with Chief Justice Berger's dissent in that case when he says that it is the responsibility of cab drivers, a responsibility of elevator operators, of secretaries, and editors of the New York Times not to engage in such activities of this sort.
How did you hear about Martin Luther King's death?
I don't recall exactly how I heard about it. I think it was actually on a television. Let's start again on that. Let me see. I don't think I remember that. Okay. I'll make some up. Go ahead now.
How did you hear about Martin Luther King's death?
Well, I was in New York at the time. I heard about it on one of the newscasts. I think it was on radio as I was in the car. And when I heard about it, I just couldn't believe that it had happened because, while Martin Luther King has become, and was even earlier, controversial, I knew him quite well. I had met him in Ghana in 1957. I had seen him also in my office and had long talks with him. I knew, of course, that he was a violent opponent of the war in Vietnam, as were many others. But I also respected him for the fact that there was no question of his not being a communist. He was pro-American. And also I considered him in terms of the black movement as being what I would call a moderate. At least he wasn't advocating burning down the buildings and raising all the kind of hells that the Black Panthers and others were. So therefore, I thought he was a very important voice in that black community.
Did you go to his funeral?
Yes, I did. As a matter of fact, one of the things I particularly remember about Martin Luther King and the enormous hold he had over the black community was a rather interesting incident I had with our driver, John Wardlaw, during the vice presidential days. This was right after the election. We had returned to Washington from California, and John was driving me down to the Capitol. And he was very emotional because he was a strong supporter. He said, "You know, I listened to the TV and heard about all of my people voting for Kennedy. He says, I want you to know I just can't understand it. He said, because all that I knew were going to vote for you. Because I had a very strong civil rights record, better than Kennedy's. Jackie Robinson and others in the black community had supported me. But he said, you know what did it? They were all for you until Bobby Kennedy called the judge in that Martin Luther King thing. And then they turned to Kennedy. So I realized that Martin Luther King had a almost religious effect on millions of black Americans.
When you were in that car in Caracas and the windows finally started breaking in and the rocks coming through, did it occur to you, or at what point did it occur to you that you might not actually get out of that alive?
Well, we have to understand the background of how we got there in the first place. Revolution was sweeping over Latin America at that time, and we were on a trip that took us to most of the Latin American countries. There were demonstrations in Uruguay, there were demonstrations in Argentina, there were demonstrations also in Peru, a very violent one there at the University of San Marcos. There were demonstrators out also in Bogota, Colombia. What had happened, though, is that the demonstrations up to that point had been ones that I had been able to handle, according to reports at the time, quite effectively. We routed the demonstrators usually by just handling them firmly, but yet in a very effective way. And consequently, they began to get rougher and rougher. And we got reports as we were flying from Colombia on to Venezuela through the CIA that plans were underway to murder the Vice President of the United States when he visited Caracas, Venezuela. They came to me, my staff did, said, what should we do about this? Should we change the plans? And I said, well, let's check. So we checked with the State Department. The ambassador said, no, he didn't see any significant problem. There were a few demonstrators and so forth, but he urged that we come forward because if we didn't keep coming, it would be a very great blow to the prestige of the United States. So I said, okay, CIA's been wrong before, maybe they're wrong this time. So we flew on in. We knew almost from the time we landed that we were in trouble. I recall the airport was totally cleared. They were afraid of the demonstrators. I remember that after we finished the welcoming speeches, I walked with the foreign minister, with Pat by my side. We walked into the airport terminal. There was a balcony immediately over it, and we were showered with spit. Frankly, it was tobacco juice spit, too. Tobacco juice spit that just covered our clothes. She had on a very bright red dress that I always liked, and it just splotched it beyond repair. My suit was done in pretty good. We got into the cars. The foreign minister was very apologetic. He says, you know, they're just children, just kids. I said, well, they're pretty tough. He handed me his handkerchief here so that I could wipe the spit off and said, no way. I said, I got to burn these clothes when I get into the residence. So we began to drive into the city of Caracas. It was ominously quiet. The streets were all cleared again, and so forth. And then we seemed to be hitting some, what I thought were potholes, thud, thud, thud. And what it was were boulders, rocks, landing on top of the limousine. Now, of course, the limousine was very heavily armored. It weighs about 4.5 tons, and it had glass, which of course was supposed to be non-shatterable. But if we drove on in, the rocks continued to fall. Several of the windows were broken, and at 2 points we had roadblocks which we were able to evade. But finally, the whole motorcade came to a screeching stop because they had stopped the truck and put it right across the 2 lanes of traffic that we were going down. So we were stopped there. And once we were stopped, it was right in an intersection. My Secret Service man, Jack Sherwood, said, "Here they come." And then just coming out on either side, down the alleys, down the streets and so forth, were hundreds of people throwing rocks and stones and carrying clubs and rushing at our car. Pretty ominous sight. They came in, they started to pound on the car, and a great big guy, several of them were young, student types, but several of them had been out of college or university for a great many years. They were the leaders. And this one fellow had a great big steel pipe, and he began to bash in the window on my side, trying to get at me. Incidentally, he knocked the window in so strong it shattered. Some of it got into the mouth of my interpreter, General Walters, and I said, "There goes my interpreter." But be that as it may, as he was pounding on this window, Jack Sherwood, my Secret Service man, was sitting right in front of me in the jump seat. And he started to grab his gun from the holster, and he said, "Let's get some of these sons of bitches." I grabbed his arm quickly. I said, "Don't do it." I said, "If you do, they'll tear us to pieces." And then as we sat there, all of a sudden, the car began to rock back and forth and back and forth. And then I knew what was happening, because I'd seen enough movies and read enough about it to know that that's the tactic of a mob. Turn a car over, burn it. And just when we were tilting almost to the point that we were going to turn over, a miracle occurred. Right in front of us in the motorcade was a flatbed truck with the cameraman on it. The driver of the truck, very intelligently, finally was able to maneuver his truck, turning it to the left out of the two lanes of traffic into the oncoming traffic, into the other lane. And we followed him. He was the blocking back. We were the running back. And this Nixon's car right back of us as well. We followed him around and came roaring on down the street on the wrong side of the street. Fortunately, nobody was coming up the other side. What should we do then? I ordered the driver go directly to the embassy. The foreign minister objected. "Oh, you can't do that. We'll get off of our schedule. We've got to go lay a wreath." I said, "We're not going to lay any wreath right now." It turned out later that that's where we really dodged the danger, the major danger, because there, where we were supposed to lay the wreath, a number of bombs, homemade ones, as a matter of fact, but effective nevertheless, were found. They would have been exploded had we gone. So we went on up to the embassy. But that was as close as anybody wants to get. I must say, incidentally, as far as that particular incident was concerned, I was hoping that one of the results would be to get a more consistent U.S. policy toward Latin America. I came back and I said, the trouble is in the United States press, the only time Latin America makes the front pages in the United States is when there's a revolution or a riot at a soccer game. I said, we've got to have a consistent policy that they understand, or otherwise the communist, and this of course was a communist-inspired mob, Radio Moscow was inciting it all the way along the line, otherwise they're going to take it by default. Well, of course, there became some interest immediately after the Caracas incident, and then it went down. But politically, it helped me, I must say. For that time, from that time forward, whenever I'd meet people who were from Latin America or who had connections with it, they would say rather admiringly, they'd say, well, whether we agree with you or not, we like you because you have cojones. I said, what's cojones? They said, balls.
Did you think, were you scared?
Oh, I was certainly concerned. But what happens in cases like that is you don't get scared, you tend to get cool. In fact, I was pretty cool. I was able to restrain Sherwood. I was able to give the order to move on and so forth. I think it's just something you almost inherit, or you learn into it. What happens is that if you go through enough crises, you're prepared when you face a big one. And I'd been through quite a lot before I ever got stoned in Caracas.
Did it occur to you that you might not survive, that you might die in that car?
Oh, certainly. Particularly when the car was rocking. Then I knew that if something didn't happen, that we may have had it. Oh, yes, that was the danger point. But before I had a chance to think about it, then we were gone.
What, was Mrs. Nixon in danger?
She was right behind us. I remember Alice Longworth had a marvelous comment about her afterwards. She said, I saw that picture of Pat, dear Pat as she called it. And there she sat talking to the wife of the foreign minister. She guessed that's who it was. And she just seemed to be talking about what they were going to do at the afternoon tea. Absolutely cool. And of course, that was the way she was. And she was naturally more concerned than I'm sure, because she was behind us. And while they hit her car a couple of times too, she could see all of these goons around us smashing the car with their clubs and everything. And naturally, she got a little concerned.
What did she say to you or you to her when you finally met
Well,
after safety?
the way it worked is that we roared out of there on our way to the embassy and finally stopped so that she could catch up. And she didn't go into any great flights of hysteria or something like that. She says, thank God that fellow had the good sense to move out. She saw it better than we did because she saw it in perspective from the car right behind. And afterwards, I must say, I was never more happy to be inside an American embassy than on that occasion. And incidentally, I did finally burn that damn suit. And I think she never was able to wear the red suit again, one of my favorites, because it was so messed up. Spit is bad enough, but tobacco spit, that's the worst. That's the lowest.
I'll accept that and hope I have no experience to confirm it. Many people felt, and I'm sure still feel, that one of the worst crimes of Watergate was a crime of the heart, in that you let your daughter Julie go out and defend you for weeks, months, after it had to be clear to you that your case was indefensible. Why did you do that?
Well, I actually didn't have much choice. I didn't want her to do that. I didn't want the family at all to do it. But Julie is a very persistent person. Of all the people that I have known, I would say that she has perhaps the greatest aptitude for political leadership. I'm not surprised when people, after they've seen her on television, say, there's the first woman president. I don't know that she'll ever go into politics, but she has the capabilities. She's effervescent, she's bubbly, she's intelligent, she has a big heart, and yet she has an inner strength, which is very, very formidable. And she never gives up. She used to say over and over again after 1960, when are we going to ask for a recount in Cook County? She never gave up. And in this instance, I said to her, I do not think that we're going to survive. I said, this is just too tough. I don't think you should go out there, because I didn't want her to go through what she had to do. I said, these press people are vicious, and since they can't get at me, I'm not meeting them at the present time, they're going to take out on you. I'll never forget the way she answered. She says, but Daddy, we have to fight. So she insisted in going out.
Moving on briefly to Japan. What's your opinion, your assessment of Prime Minister Nakasone?
He is potentially one of the truly great Japanese leaders. Now, incidentally, Japan has been very, very fortunate to have excellent leadership, better than average leadership since World War II, beginning with Prime Minister Yoshida, Kishi, Sato, et al. But Nakasone is from a newer generation, somewhat. He is a man who takes a higher profile than the others could take at that particular time in Japan's history. I think he's going to take the Japan today, which is an economic giant, and make it not a military giant, but at least see that it is no longer a military pygmy, not even able to defend itself. And also, I think very properly, he's going to have Japan play a higher posture, as the Japanese would put it, role on the world stage. And I think they should.
Do you think Japan should rearm?
No question about it. I said that back in 1953. By rearming, let me be very precise, Japan should not acquire nuclear weapons. They shouldn't, for reasons that everybody can understand, having to undergo, as they did, the first, and I hope last, use of nuclear bombs in warfare. But on the other hand, Japan should acquire the ability to defend itself. It has armed forces about 1/3 the size of those of North Korea today. That doesn't make any sense. The Japanese should be able to protect its sea lanes. They've got to have land forces to protect themselves on land, rather than having the U.S. not only hold the ring against the nuclear threat from the Soviet Union, but otherwise.
How strong is the Soviet threat to Japan?
Oh, it's very significant. There are far more SS-20s, for example, aimed at Japan and at China than there are at some of the countries of Western Europe. And that SS-20, just a few of them could take out the whole island. Also, the Soviet threat is internal. Fortunately, the Japanese have a very strong political system. At the present time, the ruling party is in very successfully, and the Socialist Opposition Party is also anti-communist. But the communists are always there. It is relatively small. They are suffering from a number of problems of their own doing, poor policies in the past. But Japan, at the present time, for that reason, has to have a good, strong economy, because if its economy becomes weak, you open the door for more Soviet influence.
Do you think that the Soviets are behind the Japanese peace movement?
No question about it. No question about it. The Japanese peace movement, let me put it this way, there would be some Japanese peace movement even if there were no Soviets. But on the other hand, I think the Soviets play a greater role in the Japanese peace movement than they do, for example, in the American peace movement, because it's much closer. And in that particular area, the Soviets have enormous influence.
What do you see happening in Japan in, say, the next 10 years?
Well, I think in order to understand what happens in the next 10 years, we've got to understand why Japan has recovered as it has from World War II. Look at this country. It's a country with no oil, no significant natural resources. The coal is virtually gone. It has less arable land than the state of California. And yet today, it is the second economic power in the free world. By the end of the century, it may have a per capita income larger than that of the United States. How does it happen? It's happened for several reasons, because of who the Japanese people are. Highly intelligent, a passion for education, great abilities not only to copy but to innovate, as they are in technology and many other fields. A second point is their remarkable political leadership that they've had. Here you took Japan. You talk about the miracle economically. That couldn't have happened without a miracle politically. You took Japan after World War II. They had to change from a government which was a military dictatorship in effect, a government in which you had the emperor as a religious figure. He had to get down off the throne and become a man rather than a god. And the Japanese, as a result of an odd couple in political leadership, such as the world has never seen before, General MacArthur on the one side and Yoshida, who was about half his height on the other side, they created the Constitution and the system which modern Japan enjoys today. And so as a result, it's a miracle to see what it's done economically. It's a miracle to see its political stability. And looking to the future, it's only going to go up. Japan has to be concerned about being too good. That's their problem. Because Americans are jealous of the way they moved ahead. Europeans are jealous of the way they moved ahead. But I would say it is in our interest to have Japan be strong. Because when you look at the Soviet Union and Asia, China, with all of its people and all of its resources, is still weak economically and relatively weak militarily. Japan is indispensable to peace in the Pacific, just as China in the future will always be indispensable to it. Therefore, a strong Japan must be maintained if the Soviet attempts to move into China, for example, or other parts of Asia are to be thwarted. And in that connection, therefore, the Japanese-American alliance is absolutely essential.
How do you see the development of Sino-Japanese relations in this 10-year period, say?
Sino-Japanese relations are just as important as American-Japanese relations. For example, at the present time, the major thrust of American policy toward China should be to help it develop its economy. because without a stronger economy, it cannot afford a stronger military. And until it has a stronger military, it will not be able to have the strength to deter a possible Soviet attack. Now, we can help, but the Japanese can help more. One, because they're closer. Two, because they're Asian. For example, our trade last year with Japan, or I should say our trade with China last year was $5.5 billion. Japan's trade with China last year was over $10 billion. That gives you the magnitude of the problem and the way that it can be solved. So we've got to encourage more and more Sino-Japanese cooperation.
What, if you had to choose one thing, what's the greatest danger facing Japan today?
The greatest danger is the danger of the threat from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is still there, and if the United States is not there to hold the ring against the Soviet Union, Japan is kaput. Another danger, and that's why Japan has as great an interest as we do in China, is if China, some way or other, because they give up on the West, because the United States fouls up some way its relationship with China, if China felt that it should move back into the Soviet orbit, then the Japanese would be running for the hills.
The first time you met General de Gaulle was when he paid a visit to the United States in 1960. We have a film of the departure ceremonies from National Airport in Washington.
You have made us stronger, as you have made your own nation stronger. And you have also strengthened the will of all free peoples in the cause of peace and freedom to which your nation and our nation is devoted. Au revoir, Washington, aimable et magnifique capitale. Au revoir, Monsieur le Vice-Président.
What were your first impressions of Charles de Gaulle?
Well, I had my first impressions of de Gaulle before I ever met him. I was in France in 1947, and all the Foreign Service people that I met spoke of him with absolute dislike, and certainly thought that he was finished. I had the impression from reading the press, the media at the time, that he was virtually a dictatorial type, almost a fascist, rigid, difficult. Also, I had been reading a little of Churchill, and Churchill was really devastating in his commentary on de Gaulle. He said, of all the crosses I have to bear, the heaviest is the cross of Lorraine. Cross of Lorraine, of course, was de Gaulle's standard. And he said, you know, de Gaulle thinks he is Joan of Arc. He said, the trouble is my bloody bishops won't let me burn him. So under the circumstances, when I first met de Gaulle, when he came on this trip, I expected to see a rather austere, dictatorial, a difficult kind of a person. I saw someone quite different. One dignified, yes. One with enormous self-confidence. One who was very impressive, who gave off an aura of charisma, of command. Some men have it, very, very few. He was one who has it in spades. And after I got to know him, one who became more and more impressive as you knew him.
In 1963, when you were in Paris, he gave you a luncheon at the Élysée Palace. Why did he receive you at what had to be the lowest ebb of your political career, do you think?
Well, frankly, I don't know. I wondered at it at the time. After all, at that time, I had been defeated for President of the United States. I had been defeated for Governor of California. I had burned my bridges in spades as far as the press were concerned. And here I was in France on a trip with my family. I didn't ask to see him, and we received this invitation to the Élysée. He may have had several motivations. One, the obvious one, is that, well, he thought just possibly I might come back again. I, of course, didn't feel that, and I don't think he would have felt that either. The other point, however, that should be made in that connection is he was one who, he thought I might come back again. Another point that may have a factor that may have affected him, was that he had a very low opinion of some other American political figures. He was quoted as saying that you ready?
Yes.
Oh, the fly, you get it? Oh,
No.
that's what he's saying? All right.
That he had a low opinion. The second reason was he had a low opinion of others.
The second reason was that he had apparently a very low opinion of some American political leaders. He was supposed to have said at one time that President Kennedy reminded him of an assistant hairdresser trying to comb through problems. Well, whatever the case might be, he did receive me. I think there was a deeper reason as to why he received me on this occasion. There was a certain empathy there. He never mentioned it as far as I was concerned, but he made a very revealing comment to General Vernon Walters, Dick Walters, when Walters took him a letter that I had written to him, a handwritten letter, when he announced that he was resigning from the office of President of France. He said, like myself, he has been an exile in his own country. He had been in the wilderness. He had gone through adversity. I had been in the wilderness and gone through adversity. He appreciated that. And I think he respected it and admired it, and therefore saw things and possibilities in my career due to the fact that such things had happened to him.
What was the luncheon? What is luncheon at the Élysée Palace with General de Gaulle like?
Well, first of all, coming to the Élysée was a great thrill for me. I'm somewhat of a Francophile. I had 4 years of French in college and read Rousseau and the other French classics in French. And also I had read a lot of French history. You came to this great building, and the only thing really that surpasses it in the places I visit is the Vatican. Because in this same trip, incidentally, I was received by Pope, and the family as well, by Pope Paul, the day before the coronation took place. But in any event, we drove through the gates and went into lunch. The lunch was set up outdoors. It was in the summertime, beautifully done, as of course any French chef would do it, and of course de Gaulle had the best. But very friendly. The only 6 people present, President and Mrs. de Gaulle. She's a very remarkable person, incidentally. And the Bolins, Mr. and Mrs. Bolin, he was the ambassador, and Mrs. Nixon and myself.
In your memoirs, you wrote about a toast that General de Gaulle made at that luncheon, which turned out to be very prophetic.
Yes. After the toast,
can you begin with just after?
What?
With just after the toast?
You want to
Without
say?
saying yes.
Oh, yes, fine. Don't say yes, fine. Now, in his toast, is that what you want me to say?
After the luncheon.
No. After the luncheon, de Gaulle proposed the toast. It was a surprise to me, and I think even a greater surprise to Bolin, because he said, in effect, he said, I realize that you have been checked in the pursuit of your goals, but I have sensed that there is no doubt but that at some time in the future you will serve your country again in an even higher capacity. Well, that's the first time I'd ever heard anybody, even among my closest friends and supporters in the United States, let alone abroad, indicate that I might have a political future. And it really shocked Bolin. He wasn't bitter about it or anything like that, but he says that was really a remarkable statement. Now, again, you could say, well, de Gaulle's just smart enough to say that to anybody, because, you know, we always say nice things to our visitors, particularly if we're fellow politicians. It doesn't cost anything, makes them feel good, and someday it may be useful to you. But the interesting thing here was that I have talked to several French leaders, cabinet officers and others through the years. And over they tell me that de Gaulle at various times has told them that same thing, prior to the time I was elected in 1968. In fact, there was a very amusing incident. It occurred at a time that they were having de Gaulle inspect the new quarters, guest quarters at the Trianon Palace at Versailles for distinguished guests. And as they were going through it, they went through the area that was for the president or whoever it might be, the head of state who was coming there. And the bathtub was apparently quite a small one. And the guide said, you know, this bathtub looks a little small for Johnson. De Gaulle smiled. He says, yes, but it looks about right for Nixon.
What are your main recollections of your trip to Paris and your visit to with de Gaulle in 1969 when you were now president, when his prophecy had been fulfilled?
I would say that first just arriving there, this was the first state visit to Paris as president. I had been there, of course, as vice president. And no one does protocol better than de Gaulle. He believed that that was a very small price to pay. And he did this, he put on the same show. I learned later from General Walters, who was in our aid in the embassy, military aid, whether it was the leader of a small African or Asian country, he did the same for them as he did for the President of the United States. But it was magnificent. But it was a bitter cold day. And the aides had told me that I have to wear my overcoat and gloves and all that business and so forth. And so I had it on. And as the plane pulled up to the apron, I saw de Gaulle standing there. Here's a 78-year-old man standing erect, no hat, no coat. So I took off my overcoat and walked down to meet him. Symbolism. He dealt in symbolism. He thought that was very important, just to show that respect. He was not going to wear an overcoat. He knew what the pictures would look like as well. And then, too, I have memories of many things that happened. We had hours and hours of talk. I just impressed by the way he was able to. He reminded me of MacArthur. He talked with precision. You could take de Gaulle's conversation, transcribe it, and never have to change a comma or anything, or a word for that matter. He didn't talk in commas too much. The precision of it, he spoke, for example, then, as he had clear back in 1963, about the importance of the United States talking to China and negotiating with China now when they needed us, rather than waiting until later when they would be so strong we would have to talk to them because we needed them. He talked about the need to bring the war to Vietnam to close. He talked, for example, very effectively about what has been called détente. He said, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to break down the Berlin Wall? If you're not ready to make war, make peace, but make it on a very strong basis, from strength rather than from weakness. All these conversations impressed me. But I think even more, those times when he'd speak philosophically, because he was a philosopher. He was a philosopher-statesman without question and without a peer, in my view. We were sitting in a beautiful room in Versailles where the conversation was taking place. And in a break in the conversation, he walked over to a window and, speaking to no one in particular but to everyone, he looked out the window and he said, Louis XIV ruled all of Europe from this room. And then another case, he was talking about World War II and the hopelessness of all war, particularly modern war. And he said in World War II, all the nations of Europe lost. 2 were defeated. He had the ability to put everything so precisely, so well. And then the final memory, the great dinners, the toasts that he prepared, a conversation with Mrs. de Gaulle, where she, speaking of their closeness to the family, made the point that the presidency is temporary, the family is permanent. And then finally, going to the airport, getting ready to leave, making the departure statements, de Gaulle escorting us out on the apron to the ramp, foot of the plane, shaking hands, getting into the plane. Then the custom is for the head of state to go back into the reception room and wait for the plane to take off. And I assumed that's what he would do. I got into the plane. And then as the plane was taxiing down the runway to take off, I looked out. De Gaulle was still standing there, standing on the ramp in a salute. Symbolism again. I think he did that because he felt that after very difficult years with both Kennedy and Johnson, that finally there was in the White House a president like Eisenhower who understood France, who would restore the French-American relationship, and who understood and respected de Gaulle.
De Gaulle's image was formidable, to say the least, and he spent a lot of time and effort creating it and maintaining it. Did you get a chance to see the man behind the myth, so to speak?
To an extent, yes. I saw it certainly, well, let me put it this way. Mrs. Nixon saw it. He was a very thoughtful